Hello and welcome to the Drupaleasy screencast on cloning a WebEnabled.com based Drupal site down to your local machine and getting it up and running. So there's a couple of assumptions that we have to make for today's screencast, and that is, number one, you need to have a local AMP stack. Now this screencast is going to be based on my Mac, so I'm actually using MAMP Pro as my AMP stack. You can also be using Dev Desktop from Acquia, which works with Windows or Mac. Other popular choices are sometimes WAMP for Windows and Uniform Server for Windows as well. You'll also need a free account at WebEnabled.com. There are free trial accounts available that you can set up Drupal sites on and do everything in the screencast. And as well as that, you need to have SSH keys set up on your local machine, as well as your public key uploaded to your web-enabled user account. So let's close all these windows and get started. Okay, so looking at this diagram, the first thing that we should look at is kind of get an overview of what we're doing. So we're going to start on the shared web server, where we already have a site up and running. We're going to go ahead and create a local repository for that site and commit it. And then we're going to create a web-enabled repository and push our commits from our shared server to our web-enabled bare repository. And then we're going to clone that bare repository on our local machine. And then we'll use backup and migrate to copy the database over, and a SFTP program to copy our files down. So looking at our site, it's just a generic Drupal 7 site. All I've basically done is added some stories using Devel Generate. I've enabled some modules that I like admin, menu, and a couple others. But for the most part, this can be any site. It can be a completed site, or it can be something like this where you're just getting started. So if we go over to the web-enabled dashboard for the site, you'll see that we have an SSH command for the site, and we have a web accessible URL. But what we don't have yet is we don't have any version control set up. So let's go ahead and set that up. So if you click on the version control tab, and then click on Set Up Version Control, we're going to be using Git. I'm going to leave the name at the default value. That just keeps everything nice and consistent. And now this checkbox is very important. We need this checkbox so that the shared server, the web-enabled shared server, can talk to the web-enabled repository, which are actually on different machines. So this checkbox actually creates an SSH key pair between web-enabled's shared web server and web-enabled's repository. So this is very important. So we're going to keep that checked and hit configure. And what this is going to do, this is going to create a bare, empty repository on web-enabled's Git server. Okay, and now that's done. So if we go back to the overview tab, you'll see that we now have a git clone command. And we're going to use this a little bit later. But first, let's go ahead and log in via SSH to our web-enabled shared development server. So I'm going to paste the SSH command that I just copied and log in. Web-enabled is very consistent about where they put all your code. It's usually in a public HTML directory followed by the name of your site. And if we do an ls, we see that that is in fact a Drupal site. Now, let's see if we have a repository yet. If we do a git status, you'll see that we do not. So this is a very important note, that just because you add version control from the dashboard area, this does not automatically create a repository on the web server. All it did was create a repository on web-enabled's Git server. So we actually have to create a local repository here and push it up to web-enabled's Git server. So that's easy enough, luckily. We just do git init to create our repository, and then git add dot to add all of our files to the repository. and this will take a second or two. Oh, that's quite fast. And then git commit with a nice little commit message. Initial commit for our site. And there we go. And if we do git status, we see that we are now on branch master, which is the default branch in Git, and that our working directory is clean, meaning everything has been committed. So the next thing we have to do is we actually have to make the link between our shared web servers repository and our bare repository. We need to tell our shared web servers repository about this one. And we can do that via the git remote command. Git remote add, and then we can actually grab the address right from here. So we're basically telling our shared web server repository about our main remote repository. Oh, and what did I do? Oh, I forgot the name. So actually what we need is we need git remote add origin. This is what we're going, this is like an alias for this repository. And then the address. And we can verify that it took by doing git remote -v. And it says we now have a fetch and a push repository set up. In every case I've ever, or in every project I've ever worked on, they're always the same repository. So at this point, we should be able to do a git push origin master. And what this is saying is we're telling our local repository to push to origin all commits on the master branch. And this should take just a second. And there we go. It's all pushed up. And we can verify that by going to version control, and selecting on the version control browser. And you'll see that our commit is now on in our Git repository. So what did we just do? We created a new local repository, well, local to the WebEnabled server here, and then we just pushed it up to the WebEnabled repository server. So our next step is going to be to clone it down to our local machine and get stuff up and running down here. So in order to do that, let's go back to our command line, and let's exit back home. So we're back on our local machine. So I'm going to navigate to my sites directory. And at this point, as long as my keys are set up, which I know they are, I should just be able to clone that code down. So I'm going to grab this entire clone command, and I'm going to paste it, and then I'm going to put the name of the folder where I want this site to be created. If I don't put this name here, then it's just going to dump all the files right in my sites directory, but I actually want them inside a folder. So if I do that, that may have just, let me see. Okay, and we're all set. So that cloned our site down into this directory right here. All right, so in order to get this site up and running locally, what do we need? Well, we need an empty database, which we don't have set up yet. So I'm actually going to use my map tools here to launch phpMyAdmin locally. And I'm going to create an empty database called DCSP-G3. Again, I like to keep everything nice and consistent. And that's been created. So I can close that window. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a virtual host here for the site, dcspg3.dev. Now, depending on which AMP stack you're using, you may or may not have to do this. but this lets me access the site I just cloned at this nice little friendly URL. So I'm going to hit apply. It's going to tell me I have to restart the servers. And then I should be able to come over here and type in DCSP g3.dev. Google's going to say, do you mean this? And I'm going to say yes. And then we're here. So we're at an installation profile page, at the install page, rather than here, because we haven't copied the database down yet. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to set up the site locally with just the stock install, and then in a minute, we're going to copy the database down. So we're just going to go through Drupal's installation process here. And I just set up the database, so I know what its name is. All right, so let's put in our normal info. Turn that off. And our installation is complete. And we have a stock Drupal 7 site. So we're actually all done with the Git stuff. So what did we do? We had a site all set up on our web-enabled shared web server. We created a repository, and then we used the git add remote command to link our local repository here with our web-enabled version control not shared repository, but main repository here. And then we use git clone on our local machine to copy this repository back down here. So now I should have backup and migrate installed on both. Let's see if I've actually enabled them. Yes, I have. So on our remote server, on our web-enabled server, I'm going to download a copy of the database using backup and migrate. And that's already downloaded. And then on our local server, I'm going to go to the backup and migrate module. Oh, I have to turn it on. Let's enable that first. So we'll go to modules, turn on backup and migrate. And then go to configuration, backup and migrate. Now, since this is local, we need to copy that database in. So we want to restore. So we want to restore our site to a particular database. And the database we're going to choose is the one we just downloaded from the web-enabled site. So we're going to choose, and it's going to be here in downloads. There it is, DCSP G3. I'm going to hit open. And you have to be really careful with this, because this is literally going to delete the local database and replace it with whatever's in that file we just downloaded. So always be really careful with this, and always make lots of backups if you're not sure. So this looks like it should be done. If we go home, there we go. And you can see that if we go home on our remote site as well, here's the first story we created on web-enabled. And now it also exists on our local site. And you can tell the local site by the URL. Don't worry about this name right here, because this name just got copied over with the database as well. So we're actually on our local site. So the one missing piece here is we don't have our images yet. So we can do that a bunch of different ways. I actually prefer to use Drush rsync to do that, but that's kind of out of scope for this screencast. So let's just use FTP or SFTP. So I'm going to use a program called CyberDuck for the Mac. And what we're going to do is we're going to need some information here. We're going to need our username and password from our web-enabled account for this site that we originally set up. So if we come over here to CyberDuck, if I can find it, there we go. I'm going to cancel that, and I'm going to go open new connection. I'm going to choose SFTP, and the server, all this stuff is listed right here. The server is dscpg3.dev4.webenable.net. My username is w_dcspg3. I'm not going to use a password because I'm going to use my public private key authentication. So I'm going to select that. And that's going to say, all right, well, point to your private key. So I'm going to point to it. So it has that. And then I can hit connect. Now I need the passphrase for my key, which I'm not going to tell you, because everybody's is different. But this dumps us right into our web-enabled server. So again, we're going to go into public HTML, and then dcspg3, and here's our Drupal site. And I'm going to open up a Finder window over here as well. So we have these side by side. So what I need to do is I need to find the files directory on my web-enabled site and copy it down to my local site, because the files directory is where all the images live. So that's going to be in sites, default. And there's our files directory. So we need to put it in the same place on our local machine. So we go into sites, default, and we're going to copy our files over right there. Now you have to be careful doing this because this copies your files wholesale. So this is why rsync solutions are generally better, because when you use rsync, it only copies over new or updated files. So you have to be a little bit careful when you're doing this. And since this is a new site, I'm just going to go ahead and tell it that's fine to overwrite. This will just take a second. There aren't that many images. And that's it. So now if we go back to our local site and just hit refresh, we're all set. We have now cloned our web-enabled site down to our local machine. And as an added bonus, everything is in Git. So if we come over to our local machine, and I know I'm on my local machine because of my prompt, I'm going to go into my directory, G3. Let's go ahead and just download a module for that. Let's do drush dl views. So we're going to download views. And then if I do a git status, you'll see that views is untracked. So I want to add views to my repository. Git add sites all modules views, and git commit added views module, and then git push origin master. And again, this is telling Git to push any commits, or push all commits to origin on the master branch. So it's pushing those up. So what did this just do? We basically added a file over here, and now we've pushed it up to here. So our repository knows about it, but our shared web server doesn't know about it yet. So if we look at our repository viewer, we should see that commit. Oh, there we go. Commit message, added views module. There it is. But if we go to our web-enabled site, we're not going to see modules there. We're not going to see views there, I'm sorry. We don't see views there because we haven't fetched it to the web server yet. So let's do that really quick, and then we'll be all set. So I'm going to use the up arrow here to find my SSH command that I used before. I'll log back in there to my remote web-enabled server, and navigate my way back into my site, and I'm going to do a git fetch origin, which basically says fetch any commits from origin that I don't have yet. And then I'm going to rebase them on top of my current branch. Origin master. And now, if we reload our web-enabled site, we now have views. So that's it. So that completes this screencast, and thank you very much for watching.